When I was first hired by Dan Kiley, Phil Shipman said to me, we have this roof garden that has to be designed. And that was early 1963. So I think the Oakland Museum might have been in the office maybe for a couple of months or something by that time. The design of the Oakland Museum was kind of a unique thing because it was something that hadn't been done before. There were no large-scale roof gardens done anywhere in the country. There was one in California at Kaiser, one in Hartford done by Sasaki, Constitution Plaza. So there was very little information to go by. And it was very complicated because it was a non-building covered with a lattice, a covering of landscape that oozed over the whole surface at different levels. How do you illustrate that? It was very complicated because of the different levels. The first time I drew a drawing for Dan, I sent it out to him, and when he came back, I said, how did it go? And he said, oh, I didn't use it. So we knew we had a complicated thing to show. So we devised a scheme for making a big box of styrofoam, 4 feet square, and backlighting it, and hanging sheets of various levels of the planting in front of it, and then combining them to make composites, and taking slides of those. And those slides then were used to make a presentation to the client, and it was very easily understood then. We used that technique even on the Ford Foundation. I used it in a similar way. So the museum was really this complicated layering of materials that all had the same physical requirements of sun, soil, irrigation, drainage, and all the other physical elements. And yet they all had to relate to one another at different levels, the most arid plants being at the top and everything else down at the bottom, and intertwined with some of the existing trees as well. So all this thing got very complicated and required a lot of meetings going back and forth, a lot of drawing exchanges, but more importantly was the model that Kevin Roche had in his office, which could be used to actually see all these levels, and even walking into a portion of it, which was larger scale, to experience some of these parts. That's how Arrow did so many of his projects, because they were so sculptural. He had to have models of almost everything, sometimes even full-scale portions of it. Roche and Dinkler, Kevin had built this model of the museum, and he also had a partial model that you could actually walk into part of it, because it was very complicated. It was almost 180 planters on top of the whole museum complex, which even had part of the thruway going underneath the corner of it, and museums inside, plus restaurants and all other kinds of facilities. I thought, how am I going to learn the California plants in this short a time? So I wrote to Sunset Magazine and said, could you send me some back issues of Sunset? Those days, and there were no books on California landscape plants or materials. Since then, Sunset came out with all their books, the Western Garden Book and so on, but at that time, they just had their magazine, which they had very nicely illustrated articles about, arid plants in this location or something else in another location. So they wrote back and said, we don't have the magazine, but we can send you cut sheets. So we got all these cut sheets from I don't know, probably about 10 years of Sunset Magazine. And I took all these and I went through and assembled the ones that had the same requirements for a planter. For instance, up at the top where the olives were, all the arid plants that would require less water because the watering would have to be done automatically for each planter, and all the way down through. Also, when I came into the job, Dan had already talked with Geraldine Knight Scott, Jerry Scott in California, because she was a real expert on plants. She had given him a lot of advice about what to do. When I came on, then I started to talk to Jerry, and we talked about soils, talked about irrigation, and the plants. And so the plants that I had found in the process from looking at the cuts from Sunset, I'd put groups together, and then I would send it out to Jerry and said, what do you think about this? And she'd say, oh, this looks fine, or why don't you try this or something? So we sort of went through the process that way to make sure we had it right. And I went out, I made several trips out, and we met together out there and talked about it. And it worked out very well. She was very accommodating and very good with it. Each planter had its own soil, with the plants that would work in that soil. And these are all playing against one another. You can imagine how complicated this was with almost 200 planters and all having to work together, so it's all one tapestry with everything, some of the vines hanging over the edges, other things going up this way, going that way, to make it all work together, have the colors all work and so on. It was a very complicated plan. And we had to draw it as well. And even the working drawing, the planting plan, had to be done with different symbols for each plant. We showed every ground cover plant in the plan. It was amazing. This was all done during two nights till 4 in the morning to get this whole working drawing plan done. We did it. And that's how it was built. So it was an interesting process, and it worked.